This lesson is on using the for loop to loop through code in PHP. Looping is something that's done when you need to have a repetitive task done over and over again. Now, it's usually not exactly the same thing. Some data may change or variable value changes, but you get power out of running code in what they call a loop, getting it to go over and over and over again for as many times as you need it to go. I'm showing here now just an HTML form on the window. Now, I hardwired that. I have 5 entries for team members. And when I run that, it's going to go through it and display it back to me with a simple loop as well. Let's go ahead and put some names in. Bob, Jane, Mary. I won't even fill it up. I'll just fill in 4. Hit the button. Now, down here is where I get the response to that. Steve, Bob, Jane, Mary. Up at the top, I'm showing you just a very simple loop that I did where I'm putting out line numbers. And I want to show you the code. So first, we look at the HTML, and I've written 5 separate input type equals text tags. Member 1, member 2, 3, 4, and 5. I kind of hardwired it as opposed to generating this through code. But let's look at the PHP now, and we'll see how we process this using a loop. The very simple loop I wanted to show you is this is called a for loop. It begins with the keyword FOR, for. Now within the parentheses, I'm going to specify some conditions and some counters. But before we look at that, the whole idea of a loop is to take the code that is present between the curly braces and do it over and over again. Remember when I ran the program, we saw, let me go back to the window, line 1, line 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? Well, I didn't output those directly. No, I used a loop to get those 5 lines to print out with just a little bit of variation. Here, I printed out the literal line colon, and then this variable here called $II, and then a break, so every line didn't appear on the same line on the web page. Let's take a look at this critical information that's between the parentheses after the for loop. The $II is an index. It's basically just a counter. You could give it a more meaningful name if you'd like. It's kind of traditional to use $I or $J, and a little trick is to repeat that and have it be $II or $JJ. Because if you're ever looking for that code in a larger program, it's easier to look for that for II. You're less likely to find a random II than a random I in other text. So, I'm starting it off. The way this breaks down is there's 3 individual parts. There's the first part, second part ending with a semicolon, and the last part doesn't end with a semicolon, it just ends at the end of the parentheses. The way this is processed is the very first time code reaches this for statement, it sets $II to be equal to 1. It was just like I had done this outside of a for loop. But a for loop has special syntax, and we have to follow these little rules on how we set these things up. So this $II equal to 1 will just happen the very first time we come into the for loop, and then that never runs again. It's our initialization of the counter variable. Now, the second part says, as long as this is true, this comparison is evaluated to be true, then go ahead and do the code in the line here. So the first time, what is $II equal to? Well, it's equal to 1 because we set it to 1 just to the left of this statement. This is a comparison just like we had in an if statement. It can compare to one of 2 things. It can either be true or it can be false. No other choices. So as long as it's true, it's going to go ahead and try to execute the code between the curly braces that are below. Right now, that's just 1 line of code. So the first time in, it ignores this. It comes in and says, is this true? Yep, 1 is less than or equal to 5. So let's print out line, and then here $II is 1, and the break. And then it loops back up to the top, doesn't do this again. Before it looks at this again, it actually goes all the way to the right. And now it does this for the first time. It says bump up $II by 1. That's essentially just add 1 to it. That's the shortcut for that. We've seen that before. So now it bumps it up, and then it comes back and does the comparison again. Well, the second time in, $II is equal to 2. That's still less than or equal to 5. So it prints the next line, but the next line doesn't look exactly like the other line because we bumped up II. So it's line 2. Go back to the display. Now it's line 2. And it keeps doing this, line 3, line 4, line 5, until $II comes up and all of a sudden it's equal to 6. When it's equal to 6, this comparison fails. As soon as it fails, it jumps down to the end of this curly brace and continues the code down the program from there, very much like an if statement. Now, let's go down here. I have the other loop down here. Now that I've got you up on what a for loop does, I've set up something very similar here. We're going to process those team members. I only had 5 possible team members, so I made this the same way. II is less than or equal to 5. The member name here, I created a variable called member HTML. So instead of typing in over here, next line down, instead of putting a $post for member 1 and then a $post for member 2 and member 3, and for all 5 of them, I'm using the counter variable, the $II, and appending it to the end of the word member. So the first time in, it'll be member 1, then member 2, member 3. So I don't have to keep typing that out. So I use that value that's held in here, and I pass that to the post instead. Now when you're passing a variable to the post, don't put it in quotes. If it's in quotes, especially single quotes, it won't interpolate. It won't turn it into its value. And we want it to really be member 1, member 2, and so forth. Just pretty much like we put on the HTML. Member 1, member 2. That's what we're building in this loop. We're building this name. So each time we get the post in the loop, we're getting a different thing into this $member variable. So then it prints team member is, and I decided to number it. Team member 1 is whoever came back from member 1. Second time it loops through, be from member 2, from member 3, and so forth, until we're done, until II equals 6, and this quits and jumps to the end, and it's done. That's a special for loop. You want to use for loops when you can determine with clarity how many times you want to loop, how many times you want to go through the code that's between the curly braces. That's called an iteration of the loop. That's the technical term, where you're going to say, I'm going to iterate the loop. Every iteration happens as long as that middle segment, that comparison, is true, and then it ends.